First story, encounter on desert road. It started like any other night drive, but this one had a strange heaviness from the beginning. I had just left my parents' house after dinner, feeling a little tired, but not too worried about the long stretch of road ahead. The highway I take is surrounded by woods, with barely any streetlights, just the occasional reflector to guide you. It's the kind of road that makes you hyper-aware of your surroundings. Every noise, every shift of shadow in the trees catching your eye. The night was unusually quiet. No cars ahead, none behind, and I hadn't passed anyone for miles. Even my favorite playlist, which I usually blast to stay awake, wasn't helping the atmosphere. The stillness seemed to soak into everything, making the inside of my car feel oppressive. I tried cracking the window to let in some fresh air, but it didn't help. It was like the silence outside was a physical presence, pressing against me. My headlights carved a narrow path through the dark, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, hidden just beyond their reach. About an hour into the drive, something changed. I noticed a faint glow in the rearview mirror. At first, just a pinprick of light in the distance. It looked like another car at first, and I felt a flicker of relief. Finally, I thought, I wasn't completely alone on this desolate stretch of road. But as I kept glancing at the mirror, something about the light seemed wrong. It wasn't steady, like headlights should be. It flickered and shifted, darting left and right, almost as if it were alive. The light grew brighter at an alarming speed, and I realized it wasn't following the curve of the road at all. It was hovering. My chest tightened as I realized I couldn't hear an engine or any sound at all, just the low hum of my own car. My mind raced through explanations. A drone? A helicopter? None of it made sense. And then, before I could think further, the light surged forward with blinding intensity, illuminating the interior of my car as if it were midday. The glow was so intense that I had to squint, my eyes tearing up as I struggled to see through it. My hands were locked on the steering wheel, but I realized the car wasn't moving. I pressed on the gas instinctively, but the pedal felt dead, unresponsive. Panic clawed at my throat as I glanced at the dashboard. All the lights were out. The engine was silent. My phone's screen had gone black, and even the digital clock had stopped. I was completely powerless. The light above seemed to shift and pulse, almost like it was inspecting me. My chest felt tight, and there was a strange, low vibration coursing through the air, making my whole body feel unsteady. The hairs on my arms and neck stood on end as the realization sank in. Whatever this was, it wasn't something I could explain away. Suddenly the car began to shake, not violently, but enough to make my teeth chatter. It felt like I was being lifted. My stomach dropped as if I were on a roller coaster, but I was frozen in place, unable to move or even scream. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything went black. When I came to, the first thing I noticed was the sound. My car engine was running again. A low, familiar hum that almost felt comforting after the oppressive silence from before. But the relief didn't last long. My head was pounding, and my mouth felt dry, as if I hadn't had water in hours. For a few seconds, I just sat there, disoriented, trying to piece together what had happened. I looked around and realized I was still on the side of the road, but not in the same spot where everything had gone dark. My car was now parked at an angle on the shoulder, partially in the dirt. I don't even remember pulling over. The clock on the dashboard was blinking 12 bang, like it had reset, and my phone, now back on, showed it was 3:47 a.m. I couldn't have been out for more than a minute, or so I thought. But somehow, hours had passed. My stomach churned as the weight of it hit me. I had lost time, and I had no idea what happened during it. I tried to shake off the dizziness and nausea, but it only got worse when I noticed something on my left arm. There was a pattern of small, circular marks, almost like a series of burns, running from my wrist to my elbow. They were perfectly spaced, too perfect to be accidental. The skin around them was red and tender, and the marks themselves felt slightly raised, like scars that had formed too quickly. My first thought was that I had leaned against something hot, but I couldn't think of anything in the car that could have caused it. I touched them lightly, wincing at the sharp sting that followed. That's when I noticed another detail that made my blood run cold. My shirt sleeve was cleanly cut, as if someone had used scissors or a blade to expose that part of my arm. The edges of the fabric weren't torn or frayed. They were precise. Panic surged through me again as I scanned the rest of my body, half expecting to find more injuries. I couldn't sit there any longer. I had to get out, to breathe, to make sure I was even awake. I opened the door, my legs trembling as I stepped onto the gravel shoulder of the road. The air was cold and sharp, stinging my lungs as I inhaled deeply. The highway was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched. The glow from my headlights stretched out in front of me, but beyond that, everything was swallowed by the dark. I checked the car for any signs of damage, any clue that might explain what had happened, but there was nothing unusual. The exterior looked untouched, no dents, no scratches, nothing. But then I glanced at the ground near the driver's side and froze. There were impressions in the dirt, small but distinct, arranged in a perfect circle about 10 feet wide. They looked like prints of some kind, but they weren't from any animal or machine I'd ever seen. The shapes were too symmetrical, almost geometric, and they pulsed faintly with a bluish hue, like they were still holding on to whatever energy had created them. I wanted to run, get in the car and drive as fast as I could until I was surrounded by people and lights, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I stood there staring at those strange, glowing impressions in the dirt, my mind racing to make sense of it. I told myself it had to be something explainable, maybe a trick of the headlights or tire marks from another car. But deep down, I knew none of that fit. The shapes were too perfect, and they seemed to hum faintly, like they were alive in some way. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I forced myself to take a step closer, just one to see if I was imagining it. The moment I did, the humming grew louder, vibrating in my chest. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, an almost magnetic pull. My head started to spin again, and for a moment I thought I might black out. I stumbled back to the car, fumbling with the door handle as panic overwhelmed me. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped my keys twice before finally managing to start the engine. The car roared to life, and for a second, I felt a surge of relief. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, that relief vanished. The light was back. It wasn't as bright this time, but it was unmistakable. A bluish glow hovering just behind the car, far enough away to seem harmless, but close enough to make my skin crawl. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires skidding slightly on the loose gravel before catching the pavement. The car lurched forward, and I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, too terrified to look back again. The lights stayed with me, though, trailing at a steady distance. It wasn't trying to catch me, but it wasn't letting me go either. I drove, for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes, my grip on the wheel so tight my knuckles were white. The light didn't waver, didn't dim, just followed me like it was tethered to the car. I tried everything, speeding up, slowing, down, even swerving at one point to see if it would react. Nothing worked. It stayed perfectly in sync, always the same distance away. My chest felt like it was being crushed under the weight of my own fear, every breath shallow and ragged. And then, without warning, it was gone. One moment, the glow filled my mirrors, and the next, There was nothing but darkness. I almost didn't believe it at first, half expecting it to reappear the moment I let my guard down. But the road stayed empty, the only light now coming from my headlights. I kept driving, not daring to stop until I reached the outskirts of the next town. When I finally pulled into the parking lot of a small gas station on the edge of town, my whole body was shaking. The fluorescent lights overhead felt blinding after the oppressive darkness of the highway, but I welcomed it. I parked close to the building, as if being near people and light would somehow protect me. For a moment, I just sat there, my hands still gripping the wheel, unable to move. I tried to rationalize what had happened, to convince myself it was just exhaustion or a hallucination brought on by stress. But then I saw the marks on my arm again. In the harsh light of the gas station, they looked even worse, angrier, redder, and more pronounced. My chest tightened as I realized I couldn't explain them away. I didn't remember touching anything, and there was no logical reason for the sleeve of my shirt to have been cut like that. I felt sick all over again. I stepped out of the car and went inside, hoping to find some sense of normalcy. The clerk barely looked up as I walked in, and for a brief moment, I thought about asking for help. But what could I even say? That I had been followed by a glowing light and lost hours of my life? That I woke up with strange marks on my arm? I knew how crazy it would sound, so I didn't say anything. Instead, I grabbed a bottle of water and a pack of gum, trying to act normal as my heart raced in my chest. When I got to the counter, the clerk finally looked at me, and his expression shifted. "You okay?" he asked, his voice hesitant. I nodded quickly, avoiding his gaze. "Long drive," I muttered, my voice barely steady. He didn't push, but I could feel his eyes on me as I left. The rest of the drive home was uneventful, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Even in the safety of my house, with the doors locked and the lights on, I couldn't shake it. I checked my arm in the mirror again, hoping the marks would look different, less ominous in the morning light. But they didn't. If anything, they seemed even more pronounced. I spent hours lying awake, replaying everything in my head, searching for answers that wouldn't come. To this day, I don't know what happened on that road. I've read stories, watched documentaries, tried to find something, anything that could explain it. But nothing feels right. I still have those marks on my arm, faint scars now, but enough to remind me every day that it was real. I wish I could say it was just my imagination or a strange dream, but I know better. Something happened to me that night, and I don't think I'll ever fully understand what. If you're enjoying this and want to support the channel in bringing more spine-chilling stories like this, any contribution is greatly appreciated. The donation link is pinned in the first comment, and even the smallest support means so much. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Second story, marked by the unknown. It all started a few months ago, but at first I didn't think much of it. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like I'd just run a marathon. The dreams were always the same, a blinding light, cold air that seemed to sting my skin, and then them. These tall, thin figures with skin the color of ash and eyes so big and dark they seemed like bottomless pits. They didn't speak like we do, no mouths moving, but I could hear whispers, faint and unsettling, like a language that didn't belong here. I always woke up before anything made sense, my left arm aching like I'd slept on it wrong. I brushed it off as stress or bad sleep posture, but the dreams kept coming, night after night. One morning, after a particularly vivid dream where I swear I felt cold, metallic hands gripping my arm, I noticed something was off. There was this tiny bump on my left forearm, right below the skin. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. It wasn't a bruise or a bite, just this small, hard lump that almost felt like a grain of rice embedded under my skin. When I pressed on it, there was this weird sensation, like a faint buzz or static running up to my fingertips. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a cyst or something harmless. But the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't ignore it, especially since every time I had one of those dreams, the ache in my arm seemed to get worse. Out of curiosity, and maybe a little paranoia, I showed it to my friend Mark, who's a doctor. He joked that I was overthinking, but agreed to take a closer look. He even did an X-ray at his clinic to humor me. Here's the weird part. The X-ray showed nothing. Not even a shadow or a hint of something under the skin. Mark shrugged it off, said it was probably just some scar tissue or inflammation and that I should keep an eye on it. But it didn't sit right with me. I knew there was something there. I could feel it every time I pressed on it. And the dreams, they didn't stop. If anything, they got more intense, like those figures were trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand. It felt like I was losing my mind. A few days after the X-ray, I tried to push it out of my mind and move on. But that's when something even stranger happened. I was at work, just sitting at my desk, testing a new piece of equipment, a frequency scanner we use to check for signal interference in some of our devices. It's a standard thing, nothing out of the ordinary. But when I turned it on, the scanner started acting weird. It kept locking onto this faint signal, one that didn't match any frequency we usually deal with. I was intrigued, so I moved the scanner around the room, trying to pinpoint the source. That's when it hit me. The signal was strongest when the scanner was pointed at me, or more specifically at my left arm. I froze. My first thought was that the scanner was malfunctioning, but the readings were consistent. The signal was coming from inside my arm. I sat there staring at the device, my heart racing. It was broadcasting some kind of frequency, a faint but steady pulse like a beacon. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't dare mention it to anyone. At work, I didn't want to sound crazy. When I got home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I grabbed my phone, downloaded a couple of signal analysis apps, and tried to see if they would pick up anything. Sure enough, they did. The same strange frequency, the same pattern. It wasn't random. It felt deliberate, almost like it was meant to be noticed. That night, the dreams came back with a vengeance. This time, they felt more real than ever. I could feel the cold air biting at my skin again, the blinding light making it impossible to see anything clearly. The whispers were louder, more insistent, like they were trying to drill their way into my head. And then, for the first time, I saw their hands, long, thin fingers reaching out, their touch like ice. I woke up gasping for air, clutching my arm, which was burning and tingling at the same time. When I looked at the lump, it seemed more prominent than before, almost as if it had shifted or grown. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was happening, and I felt like I was completely out of my depth. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't paranoia, at least it didn't feel like it. There were moments when I'd turn a corner or glance out a window, and I'd catch myself expecting to see someone, or something, staring back at me. The lump on my arm had started to itch, but not like a rash. It was deeper, like a persistent vibration I couldn't scratch away. Desperate for answers, I started searching online for anything that might explain what was happening. I ended up down some weird rabbit holes, forums about alien encounters, abductions, and implants. I couldn't believe I was even considering it, but the more I read, the more it clicked. Other people had described similar experiences, strange dreams, physical changes, and signals that didn't make sense. I couldn't believe it, but I couldn't ignore it either. That evening, I decided to test the signal again. I used a stronger scanner this time, one I borrowed from work. The signal was still there, just as steady as before, but now I noticed something else. It seemed to pulse faintly every few minutes. like a heartbeat. My heart sank as I realized what it could mean. It wasn't just emitting a signal. It was active. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, but deep down, I knew I wasn't. The dreams, the lump, the signal, it was all connected. But connected to what? And why me? I couldn't help but feel like a lab rat, some kind of experiment under constant observation. The thought made my skin crawl, but I couldn't do anything about it. Every time I pressed on the lump, that same buzz ran through my arm like it was mocking me. The breaking point came later that night. I was lying in bed trying to sleep when I heard a low hum. At first I thought it was my imagination, but then it got louder. It wasn't coming from outside, it was inside my head. I sat up, panicking, trying to shake it off, but it wouldn't stop. And then, as suddenly as it started, the hum was replaced by a piercing tone, like the kind you hear in those hearing tests, but amplified 1,000 times. My vision blurred, and my arm started burning like the lump was heating up. I stumbled to the bathroom, desperate to see what was happening. Under the fluorescent light, I could see the lump pulsing faintly, almost like it was alive. My skin looked red and irritated, and I swear I could see faint lines, like veins leading away from it. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear that hum faintly in the background, like it was coming from somewhere deep in my brain. My arm throbbed constantly now, and the pulsing sensation from the lump seemed to spread, reaching up toward my elbow. I kept staring at it, expecting it to burst open or something, but it just sat there, mocking me with its mystery. The next morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to see if I could cut it out myself. Stupid, I know, but I felt like I was out of options. I grabbed a sterilized blade from my emergency kit and sat at the bathroom sink. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the blade. When I pressed the tip against my skin, something terrifying happened. The lump moved. I froze, watching in disbelief as the bump shifted slightly beneath the skin, almost like it was trying to avoid the blade. My heart was pounding so hard and thought it might stop altogether. I dropped the blade and stumbled backward, my arm tingling with that same buzzing sensation but now spreading across my entire body. And then, as if on cue, my phone lit up with a notification, but it wasn't from any app I recognized. The screen was filled with a series of strange symbols, lines, and dots that I couldn't make sense of. My hands were still shaking as I tried to unlock the phone, but it didn't respond. The screen just kept flashing those symbols, and that's when I heard it. The whispers. Not in my dreams this time, but clear as day, coming from somewhere inside the house. I don't remember much after that. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and echoing like dozens of voices speaking at once. My vision started to blur, and I felt this intense pressure in my head, like something was trying to get in, or maybe get out. The last thing I remember is collapsing on the floor, clutching my arm as the lump started to pulse wildly, almost like it was going to burst through my skin. When I woke up, it was morning, and everything was normal. The lump was still there, but it wasn't pulsing anymore. My phone was back to its usual home screen. No strange symbols, no evidence of what had happened. But the signal is still there. Every time I scan for it, it's waiting, steady and unchanging. And the dreams? They haven't stopped. If anything, they're more vivid than ever. I don't know what's happening to me, but I know one thing for sure. I'm not alone in this. If you're enjoying this and want to support the channel in bringing more spine-chilling stories like this, any contribution is greatly appreciated. The donation link is pinned in the first comment, and even the smallest support means so much. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Third story, the vanishing at sea. I never thought something like this could happen to me. I've spent most of my life at sea, fishing with the same guys, following the same routine, dealing with the same old stories, storms, torn nets, fish. That got away. But that night, everything changed. We were about 50 miles off the coast, in deeper waters than usual, because we heard the fish were moving further out. The boat rocked gently with the calm waves, and the only sounds were the hum of the engines and the occasional clink of metal against the hull. Then we saw it. At first it looked like the moon reflecting off the water, but we quickly realized that blue glow was coming from beneath the surface. It was bright, pulsing, and nothing like the flashing lights of ships or submarines. We stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. Mark, one of the crew, leaned over the railing and muttered, "What the hell is that?" His voice sounded different, low, almost afraid. The light started moving, gliding under the water in a way that didn't make any sense. No ripples, no sound. It felt unnatural. We tried to ignore it and focus on our work, but the tension was thick. Nobody wanted to admit it, but we were all scared. Mark, though, couldn't take his eyes off it. He just stood there, staring, down, completely fixated. We called his name, told him to leave it alone, but he didn't even blink. His eyes were wide, locked on that glow. Then, in a blink, he was gone. 1 second he was there, leaning a little too far, and the next, he was in the water. At first, we thought he slipped, but it didn't look right. I swear, it was like something pulled him in. In an instant, he disappeared under the surface. We all rushed to the side of the boat, shouting his name, throwing ropes, trying to see through the dark water. The blue light looked stronger now, like it was waiting for him. We saw him for a second, struggling to come back up, his arms thrashing against the water. But something was wrong. He wasn't swimming like someone who wanted to get out. He looked trapped, like something was pulling him down. I grabbed a rope and Brian was already lowering a hook, but it was no use. Mark sank too fast. The light swallowed him, and suddenly, it was all gone. The water was calm, perfectly still, and I could only hear my own heavy breathing. We stood there, waiting for him to surface, hoping this was some kind of sick joke. But it wasn't. He was just gone. We didn't know what to do. We kept yelling his name, scanning the water, hoping to see even the smallest ripple, but it was like he had never been there. The ocean had swallowed him whole, and the worst part was that eerie blue glow. It was gone too. 1 minute it was, lighting up the water like something out of a nightmare, and the next, total darkness. Brian grabbed the radio, his hands shaking, trying to call for help. But what were we supposed to say? Hey, our friend got pulled into the ocean by a weird light. They'd think we were crazy. I felt a knot in my stomach, this sinking feeling that we were on our own out here. We shined our flashlights over the water, desperate, but there was nothing. Just the empty waves and the quiet hum of the boat, like the ocean was holding its breath. Minutes passed, then hours. Nobody spoke much after a while. Every so often, one of us would lean over the side, looking, listening, but there was nothing. We even lowered a net, thinking maybe, just maybe, we could drag it along and find him. It came back empty every time. The silence started to weigh on us, pressing down like a heavy fog. I kept replaying it in my head. Mark's face, frozen in shock, the way his body just disappeared. I could still see it when I closed my eyes. It didn't make sense. He was a strong swimmer. He knew these waters. He wouldn't have just drowned. Like that. Something took him. We all knew it, but nobody wanted to say it out loud. The fear was thick, and none of us wanted to admit what we were really thinking. At some point, Mark, who had been the quietest of us all, finally spoke up. "We should leave," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Nobody argued. We all felt it. Something wasn't right here, and every second we stayed made it worse. We started pulling up the gear, working in silence, our hands moving automatically while our minds were somewhere else entirely. But as we were getting ready to leave, the boat lurched suddenly, like something huge had passed underneath us. We all froze. I looked over the edge again, shining my flashlight into the water, and for a split second I thought I saw it. Something massive, deeper down, just beyond the beam of light. It wasn't moving like a fish, more like it was watching. I couldn't breathe. My gut screamed at me to look away, but I couldn't. Whatever it was still there, and it wasn't done with us yet. Then the light came back. That same blue glow rising slowly from the depths, but this time it was closer, much closer. It spread underneath the boat like it was surrounding us, creeping up along the sides and reflecting off the wet metal. Brian grabbed my arm so hard it hurt, his eyes wide with pure terror. "We have to go," he said, and this time no one hesitated. I jumped into the cabin, fired up the engine, and pushed the throttle forward as far as it would go. The boat groaned under the sudden speed slicing through the water, but that glow, it didn't fade. It followed. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, and in the back of my mind, all I could think about was Mark, how he must have felt when that thing took him. And now it was after us. We raced toward the shore, the glow never leaving our side. It stayed just beneath the surface, pulsing like it was alive, like it was hunting. Nobody said a word. We were too scared. The only sound was the roar of the engine and the waves slapping against the hull. After what felt like forever, the coastline finally came into view, and as soon as we hit shallower waters, the glow started to fade. It slowed, flickering like it was losing interest, and then it disappeared, sinking back into the dark depths like it was never there. We didn't stop until we reached the dock. No one spoke as we tied up the boat, our hands still, trembling. We just stood there, staring out at the ocean, half expecting to see that glow return. But it didn't. It was gone. And so was Mark. Back on land, everything felt surreal. The dock lights, the distant sound of waves, the familiar smell of salt in the air. It was like none of it belonged anymore. We sat there for a long time, just staring at the water, half expecting that glow to show up again. But it didn't. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but we all knew we had to report what happened. The problem was, what exactly were we going to say? That Mark got pulled into the ocean by some kind of glowing thing? Who would believe us? Eventually, Brian made the call to the Coast Guard, keeping the details vague. A man overboard. Couldn't recover him. Conditions were too dark. I could hear the strain in his voice, the unspoken fear behind his words. They said they'd send out a search team at first light. That didn't make me feel any better. We knew they wouldn't find anything. When the officers showed up the next morning, we gave them the same story. Mark slipped. We tried to save him. The water was too deep. They took our statements, nodded, and told us they'd keep searching. I could see it in their faces, though. They thought we were hiding something, and we were. I kept waiting for one of us to crack, to say something about the light, about what we really saw. But no one did. Maybe because we didn't want to sound crazy, or maybe because deep down, we didn't want to face it ourselves. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The image of Mark disappearing beneath that eerie blue light burned into my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again. And every time I wondered, was he still down there somewhere? Or was he gone? Days passed, and the search was called off. Lost at sea, they said. just another fisherman who met a bad end in deep waters. But we knew better. Brian stopped coming out on the boat after that. He said he needed a break, but I could see the fear in his eyes every time he looked at the ocean. The rest of us tried to act normal, but it was like something had shifted. We weren't the same guys we were before that night. I started having trouble sleeping, and when I did, I'd wake up gasping, my chest tight with this awful sense of dread. I haven't told anyone, but sometimes, when I'm out there alone, I swear I can still see it. Just a faint flicker of blue, far out on the horizon. And every time I do, I feel like it's watching, waiting. I tried to move on, I really did, but the ocean wasn't the same anymore. It felt wrong. Every time we went back out, I could feel this weight pressing down on me, like the water itself was hiding something it didn't want us to know. The others felt it too, even if they didn't say it out loud. We kept fishing, sticking close to the coast, avoiding the deeper waters where it happened. But deep down, we all knew it didn't matter how far we stayed from that spot. Whatever was down there, it could find us if it wanted to. One night, a few weeks after Mark disappeared, I was alone on the boat, checking the equipment before an early trip the next morning. The dock was quiet, the water calm. I was just about to pack up and head home when I saw it. Faint, but unmistakable. That same blue glow, drifting just beneath the surface, out past the harbor. My stomach dropped. I stood frozen, gripping the railing so tight my knuckles turned white. It was far away, but I knew it saw me. I don't know how I knew. I just did. I didn't tell the others. What was the point? We all knew it was still out there. Some nights I'd catch Brian staring out at the water too, his face pale, his hands fidgeting like he was expecting something to crawl up onto the dock. None of us talked about it, but it hung between us, unspoken. Then, one morning, Brian didn't show up for a trip. We figured he overslept, maybe had too much to drink the night before. But when I stopped by his place, the front door was wide, open, the lights still on. His keys, his wallet, everything was inside. But he wasn't. The police said there was no sign of struggle, no evidence that anything had happened. But I knew better. The night before, I had seen that light again, closer this time, almost at the edge of the dock. I quit fishing after that, sold the boat, moved inland, as far from the ocean as I could get. But no matter how far I run, I still feel it. In the dead of night, I wake up sweating, heart pounding, convinced that if I look out my window, I'll see that glow creeping up from the darkness. Sometimes I dream about Mark, about Brian. In those dreams, they're standing at the edge of the water, staring down into it, silent. And then, slowly, they walk in. I try to call out to them, but my voice never works. They just disappear, swallowed whole. I don't know what it was that we saw that night. I don't know if it was something from deep in the ocean, or something that came from beyond it. All I know is that it took Mark, and maybe it took Brian too. And the worst part, I don't think it's done yet. I have this terrible feeling that it's just waiting for the right moment, the right person. And when it finds them, they'll vanish, just like the others. So if you're ever out there on the water, and you see a strange blue light beneath the surface, don't look at it. Don't go near it. Just leave. Trust me. If you're enjoying this and want to support the channel in bringing more spine-chilling stories like this, any contribution is greatly appreciated. The donation link is pinned in the first comment, and even the smallest support means so much. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Fourth story, The White Room Warning. I don't even know how to start this without sounding insane, but I need to get it out. It happened 2 nights ago, and it hasn't left my head since. I'd gone to bed like any other night, exhausted from work. And the last thing I remember was scrolling through my phone until I fell asleep. But then, out of nowhere, I woke up. Not in my room, not in my bed, but in this blindingly white room. The kind of white that doesn't just hurt your eyes. It feels like it's swallowing you whole. There were no windows, no doors, no corners. Just smooth, uninterrupted walls. It was so empty that I could hear my own breathing echo back at me, like the room itself was alive. At first I thought it was a dream. I tried to move, but my arms were strapped down to this cold metallic chair. My wrists were bound with something I couldn't see, but I could feel the pressure. Panic hit me like a punch to the chest. I pulled and twisted, trying to free myself, but it was no use. And then I saw them. 3 shapes standing just a few feet away from me. They weren't human, but they weren't monstrous either. Their skin, or whatever it was, looked smooth and almost reflective, like polished stone. They had no mouths, no noses, no ears. Just these deep, dark indentations where their eyes should have been, staring straight through me. I wanted to scream, to ask who they were and what was happening, but my voice wouldn't come out. I couldn't even move my head. That's when I heard them, not with my ears, but in my head. Their voices didn't sound like words exactly, more like thoughts being pressed directly into my brain. They said things I didn't understand at first, like fragmented warnings. The balance is tipping. Time is running out. The earth is failing. It was like they were speaking in riddles, and every word left this heavy, sinking feeling in my chest. I kept thinking, why me? What could I possibly have to do with any of this? One of them stepped forward, and I swear I could feel the air shift around me. It reached out with this long, thin hand and touched my forehead with its fingertip. The second it made contact, my entire body locked up. It wasn't pain, it was something worse, like my brain was being force-fed images I didn't want to see. I saw forests burning until there was nothing but ash, oceans drying up until their floors were cracked and barren, and cities swallowed by dust storms. I could feel the heat, the choking dryness, the desperation. It was so vivid, like I was there, living it. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I snapped back into the white room, gasping for air like I'd been drowning. My body was drenched in sweat and my head was pounding. The 3 figures hadn't moved. They just stood there, their presence overwhelming, like they didn't need to do anything else to make their point. But then they spoke again, if you can even call it speaking. They told me this wasn't a punishment, that they weren't here to harm me. This is a warning, they said, for your kind. My kind. I realized they were talking about humans. They didn't sound angry, but there was something in their tone, if you can call telepathic voices a tone, that felt cold and final, like they didn't believe we could fix whatever it was they were showing me. I wanted to ask them what they expected us to do, but my body wouldn't respond. I just sat there, frozen, as they turned away from me. I don't even know how they left, because one second they were there, and the next they weren't. The room was empty again, except for me and the suffocating white. I blinked, and everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in my bed, staring at the ceiling, like nothing had happened. When I woke up, I thought for a second that maybe it had all been some vivid nightmare. But then I sat up, and my wrists burned. Looking down, I saw red marks circling them, almost like bruises. They looked exactly like the spots where I'd been bound in that chair. That's when the panic hit me again, full force. It didn't make sense. If it was just a dream, how could I have these marks? I got up and stumbled to the bathroom, my legs shaky, like I hadn't used them in days. I turned on the light and stared at myself in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes bloodshot, and there was a faint smear of something grayish on my forehead, like ash. I wiped at it, but it didn't come off right away. It was like a reminder, something left behind from whatever touched me. I tried to calm myself down. I told myself it was just sleep paralysis or something, a trick of the mind. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was real. My chest felt heavy, and my head was spinning with flashes of those images. The burning forests, the dead oceans, the cities buried in sand. It was too clear, too vivid to be a product of my imagination. And those figures, I couldn't stop thinking about how they'd looked at me, or through me, like I was just a speck in the grand scheme of whatever they were dealing with. The rest of the day felt like I was moving in a fog. Everything around me seemed dull, like the world had lost its sharpness. I kept replaying the whole thing in my head, trying to make sense of it. I searched online for anything similar. Stories about white rooms, beings without mouths, or people waking up with marks they couldn't explain. I didn't find much, just vague accounts on random forums that didn't feel the same. But what scared me the most was when I found posts about environmental disasters. Wildfires spreading faster than ever, coral reefs dying, heat waves breaking records. It was like the things they'd shown me weren't just possibilities. They were already happening. That night I didn't want to sleep. I was terrified I'd wake up in that room again. Or worse, that I wouldn't wake up at all. But eventually exhaustion took over. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. If what I saw was real, if those things were trying to warn me, what was I supposed to do with that? Why would they pick me of all people? I'm not a scientist, not an activist. I'm just ordinary. I felt so small, like nothing I did could possibly matter in the face of everything they'd shown me. When I finally drifted off, it didn't feel like real sleep. My dreams, or whatever they were, felt just as heavy as the day before. But this time, there was no white room, no figures. Instead, I was back in those flashes they'd shown me. I was standing in the middle of a desert that used to be a city, the ground cracked and lifeless. There were no sounds, no wind, no people, just this unbearable silence. Then, out of nowhere, I heard this faint hum, like a machine far off in the distance. It grew louder and louder until it felt like it was vibrating through my chest. I woke up gasping, clutching at my shirt, my heart pounding like I'd just run a marathon. After that night, everything felt different. It wasn't just the dreams, or the memories of that room. It was the world around me. I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. The sky looked hazier, like there was always some faint layer of smoke in the air. The grass in my neighborhood park was turning yellow, even though it wasn't summer. Even the birds sounded quieter, like there were fewer of them. It was subtle, but it felt like the world itself was out of sync, like I'd been blind to it before, and now couldn't unsee it. The weirdest part was how disconnected I felt from people. At work, I'd catch myself zoning out during meetings, my mind replaying those flashes of destruction. My coworkers would laugh at some joke, and I'd sit there wondering if they had any idea how bad things really were, or if I was the only one who'd been shown. It made me feel like an outsider in my own life, like I didn't belong anymore. But at the same time, I couldn't tell anyone. How could I? Hey, I think I was abducted by some beings that told me the planet's doomed. Yeah, that'd go over great. The marks on my wrists faded after a couple of days, but the feeling didn't. I'd run my fingers over the spots where the restraints had been, almost like I was checking to make sure they weren't still there. I couldn't get the sensation of being trapped out of my head. It wasn't just physical, it was like something deeper, a kind of helplessness I'd never felt before. Those things, whatever they were, had complete control over me. And even though they said they weren't there to hurt me, there was no comfort in that. If anything, it made it worse. They didn't care about me as a person. I was just a tool for their message, a vessel for their warning. But what was I supposed to do with it? That question haunted me. I started avoiding the news because every headline felt like another piece of the puzzle they'd shown me. Wildfires, droughts, species going extinct. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion, knowing you can't stop it. I felt this overwhelming guilt, like I was somehow responsible, even though I didn't understand why. I mean, if they'd chosen me, there had to be a reason, right? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how powerless I really was. A few nights later, I couldn't take it anymore. I sat down with a notebook and started writing everything I remembered. Every detail of the room, the figures, their words, the images they showed me. It felt pointless, like trying to explain a color no one's ever seen. But I had to do something. As I wrote, I realized I could still hear their voices in my head. Faint, but there. Like an echo that wouldn't fade. The balance is tipping. Time is running out. Over and over. I started to wonder if that was the point, if they wanted me to carry this, to let it eat away at me until I couldn't ignore it anymore. The next morning, I woke up feeling drained, like the weight of everything was finally catching up to me. I tried to go about my day as normally as I could, making coffee, checking emails, pretending everything was fine. But deep down, I knew I wasn't okay. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw pieces of those flashes. The burning forests were the worst. I could almost hear the crackling of the flames and smell the smoke. It clung to me even when I was awake. And no matter how much I tried to block it out, I couldn't. The thought hit me like a slap. This wasn't going away. They'd made sure of that. I started wondering if this was how it began for other people. The ones you read about who suddenly quit their jobs, move to the mountains, or dedicate their lives to some obscure cause. Maybe they'd been chosen, too, given warnings that they didn't know how to handle. It made me feel less alone, but it also terrified me. Because if others had gone through this and the world was still spiraling the way it was, what chance did I have of making a difference? What was I supposed to do? Stand on a street corner with a sign that said, "The end is near"? No one would listen. I wasn't even sure I'd believe me if I hadn't experienced it myself. That night, something strange happened. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling like I'd done every night since it happened, when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A faint glow just above my desk. At first, I thought it was a reflection from my phone, but when I turned to look, I saw it was coming from the notebook where I'd written everything down. The glow wasn't bright. It was more like a soft bluish light, pulsing gently, like it was alive. My heart started racing, and for a second, I thought about grabbing it and throwing it across the room. But instead, I forced myself to get up and take a closer look. When I opened the notebook, the pages were blank. Everything I'd written was gone. Just seeing those empty pages made my stomach drop, like I'd lost the only proof I had that any of this was real. But then, as I stared at the blank paper, words started appearing, one by one, like they were being written by an invisible hand. "This is your burden," it said. "Remember." And then the light disappeared. I dropped the notebook and backed away, my legs shaking so badly I thought I'd fall. I haven't touched the notebook since. It's still sitting on my desk, closed, like it's waiting for me to open it again. But I can't bring myself to. Every time I even think about it, I feel that same cold dread I felt in the white room. I don't know what they want from me or why they chose me, but I know one thing for sure. This wasn't a dream. It wasn't some hallucination or trick of my mind. It was real. And now, every time I hear about another wildfire or another species going extinct, I think about their warning. I think about how they didn't seem angry, but disappointed. Like they'd already seen how this all ends, and they didn't believe we'd stop it. I still don't know if I was supposed to do something, or if they just wanted me to carry this knowledge with me, like some kind of twisted punishment. But the worst part is, I don't think it matters. Because even if I told everyone what happened, even if I screamed it from the rooftops, who would believe me? The world's already falling apart, and we're all too busy pretending it's not. Maybe that's why they chose me, to remind me, and through me, maybe someone else. That time really is running out. So, what did you think of this story? Did it scare you? Was there a part that gave you chills or stuck with you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below if you have had a similar experience or have suggestions for future horror stories. Let me know too. Thank you for watching and being part of this amazing community. See you in the next story.